You know how to walk? Let me see. Stand up and show me how you walk. That's pretty good. Now, let me ask you a question, though, before you sit down. How did you learn how to walk? You don't know. You just did it, huh? Then you probably practiced a little bit. Because I bet you were like a lot of other babies, and when you first did it, you did stuff like this. You would do this, and you'd kind of stand up, and you'd do this for a little bit, and then you just go all the way back on your bottom. And I'm not going to do that, but I bet you did. But I bet you practiced that over and over and over again until you got pretty good at it. All right, next question. Can any of you write your name? You can write your name? Let me see. Show me how you write your name. Lucia. Lucia. That's very good. Now, how did you learn how to write your name? Either your sister or your dad taught you. That's a good answer. Did you practice it a lot? Yeah. You know, because anything we do, we have to practice it. Now, somebody might show us how to make the letters, but we have to practice it to get them down. We might see other people walk, but we have to actually put it into practice before we learn how to do it. Well, this morning, I'm going to be talking to your moms and dads about putting stuff into practice so they learn how to really do it. Do you think they can do that? Maybe? I don't know. But that's what we're going to be talking about. And you guys are going to be going back there and learning some new stuff. But what I want you to think about is when you learn this stuff, I want you to learn how to do it. Okay? When Jesus teaches us things that we're supposed to do, we need to practice it, right? Okay? All right. You can't ride your bike without any training wheels? You know what? After church, come talk to me, bring your mom and dad, and I'll tell them the secret for teaching you how to do that in one day. Okay? I'm serious, man. All right, you guys going back to class. Everybody give me a high five as you go. High five, high five, high five. Low five, high five, high five. Awesome. Wow. Okay. Now, lessons for disciples. Right now, most of you know that I'm working on my degree, and I've been in school for, I think, 47 years. And there's all kinds of different teaching methods. Some of the classes that I've taken are online classes where you're assigned reading and you have tests and different things that you have to do, different projects that you have to do. Some of them are what they call intensive classes, where you go down and you sit in lectures all day for 5 days, and then you take tests, and then you'll have papers to write and a lot of books to read. And there's all kinds of different teaching styles, but I'm taking a class right now, and it's one of the most interesting classes that I've had there. It's what they call a supervised or specialized ministry experience. I had to choose an area of ministry, and I do a project. I never go down there to class. I never really have any tests or papers or anything. It is all a very hands-on program. And to me, it's been one of the neatest programs because I've learned probably more about doing ministry through this class than just about anything else. A lot of it is good theory. We learn a lot of the lessons, but then putting them into practice is a totally different story, right? How many of you have ever taken classes on, or classes, courses, anything, workshops, seminars on budgeting and finance? Any of you? And how many of you still have that down to perfection? Yeah, okay, so learning about it and putting it into practice is something different. In this class, to begin with, I had to come up with my program, and then I wrote out a contract that I sent down there to my instructor, and he looked at it and he sent it back with a lot of suggestions. You know, like one was, he said, well, I would like to see you include in your contract that you're going to put together resource team of other guys who have done this same kind of ministry that can help guide you. And so, being the good student I am, I revised my contract and I said, I will put together a resource team to help guide me of men who are experiencing this kind of ministry. And I sent it back, and he wrote back, emailed back. That's one of the bad things about emails. You do this all real quick. And I only had like 2 days to get this contract done. And he wrote back and he said, I need the names of the men who have agreed to serve on your resource team before I will agree to this contract. And it's like, dude, that means I gotta go do this, you know? It's one thing to say, this is what I'm gonna do, but it's another thing to actually have to do it, you know? And so that's why this class has been so great, is because it's challenged me to have to do some things. And the neat thing about it is, the more I read through Matthew's gospel, and the more I think about and look at discipleship, this is the same way that Jesus teaches his disciples. There are a lot of lessons that they get by sitting around listening to Jesus speak. That's the lecture stuff. There are a lot of times they get to experience things with Jesus, and then they learn things by observing. But then there are other times where Jesus just says, here, go do this. And this morning we're going to see some of those ways that Jesus teaches his disciples. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 13. I'm going to finish up chapter 13 beginning in verse 53. If you're going to be following in your pew Bibles, this is on page 692. You can follow along with us there. Chapter 13 ends with a couple of accounts of people not recognizing what God is doing. Basically, in some ways, it's failure or rejection. Now, if you go back in Matthew chapter 11, and we're not going to turn there, but I want to just kind of show you how all of this fits together. Matthew chapter 11 begins with John the Baptist sending some people to Jesus to ask, are you who we thought you were, or should we be expecting someone else? That John is in prison at that time. And that kind of sets the stage for what happens throughout chapter 11 and into chapter 12. John has been arrested, and we have 2 chapters of rejection. People that don't recognize what God is doing. John, who should understand it, even questions, is this what God is doing? And then we have chapter 11 beginning in verse 20 where it says that Jesus began to denounce the cities in which most of his miracles had been performed because they did not repent. And so we have this rejection of what God is trying to do in this world. People that don't understand. They don't see what God's plan is. And so chapter 12 is a chapter about this rejection. It seems like everything Jesus does, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are opposed to it. And they come up with some other reason. This can't be God doing it. It must be the power of Satan. It can't be God's will. This guy must be violating God's law. And they were against everything Jesus did. Then in chapter 13, we have these parables that illustrate the difference between those who reject God's will and the disciples, who recognize and accept that, yes, this is what God is doing. And so that's kind of the way it's progressed so far. Beginning in verse 53 of chapter 13, we have 2 other stories that kind of close off this section with more rejection. John, in chapter 11, John is in prison, begins the rejection. Here, we're going to end that. It's kind of a rejection sandwich is what it kind of boils down to. John chapter 13, beginning in verse 53, when Jesus had finished speaking these parables, he moved on from there. Coming to his hometown, he began teaching the people in their synagogue. And they were amazed. Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers, they asked? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters here with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, only in his hometown and in his own home house is a prophet without honor. And he did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. This was one of those things that the disciples got to see. They got to experience this with Jesus, his rejection, even in his hometown. And not only just that they rejected him, but notice it says that they took offense at him. Chuck, I like some of the language you used this morning when you were talking about the Lord's Supper. You said that even though you knew what God wanted, you were fighting against it. And you see, when you reject, when you don't accept what God's will is, for most people, it doesn't lead to apathy. It doesn't lead to, oh, whatever, who cares? But it usually leads to direct opposition or fighting or trying to overcome it. And that's what we see here. These people took offense at Jesus. It bothered them to the point where they were almost becoming aggressive toward him. And then we have another story of rejection, which closes the sandwich that begins with John in prison. And at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus. And he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead. This is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered him a prophet. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for them and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted and had John beheaded in prison. His head was brought in on a platter and was given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. And then they went and told Jesus. The rejection of what God is doing doesn't always lead to apathy as much as it leads to hostility. Herod did recognize that it was God who was working in John, and he had him beheaded. And again, the disciples learn a lesson here, just kind of sitting in this classroom and observing things, that very often those who accept and follow God's plan will be rejected, and others may be hostile to them. These stories kind of foreshadow Jesus' ministry. Again, unbelief doesn't lead to apathy, but to hostility. There was a lesson for the disciples then. There's a lesson for the disciples that are sitting here today, and that is that we can expect, if we follow the ways of the kingdom of God, we can expect to experience hostility. We will sometimes be rejected. But Jesus, at this point, doesn't spend a lot of time expanding on that. Now, later he will tell his disciples these things in a lot more clear-cut terms. But right now, it's like this story, they just get to see this. They get to experience it. And this kind of closes that section of rejection. And now Jesus is going to move in his ministry into teaching his disciples more about what is God's will, who is Jesus, and what is his ministry. Because Jesus knows that once he's gone, who is it that's going to carry on his ministry? The disciples. Okay? That wasn't a trick question, and I really meant for an answer to come from it. But he knows that they have to carry on his ministry. They don't know exactly everything about his ministry. So Jesus is now going to begin teaching them some more things. Read with me, continuing on in verse 13. When Jesus heard what happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Now think about this. A very human thing for Jesus. Those of us who have lost loved ones, very dear to us, we know what it's like, because sometimes you just want to go sit by yourself, don't you? You want to kind of get away from everybody. Just spend a little time maybe praying to God, maybe just a little time to kind of think and process things through. Jesus, John was his cousin, number one, but also John was the one that God had sent to pave the way for him. John understood what Jesus' ministry was about. He was kind of his partner. And now he finds out that not only is he dead, but he died such a violent, terrible death. Beheaded, head served up on a platter to the winner of a dance contest. And Jesus wants to get away. But hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. And you think to yourself, do these people, are they not even considerate at all? I mean, you would expect if you just found out that one of your friends had lost their loved ones and you went to their house to see them, you would probably bring a casserole, right? I mean, we're church folk. We bring casseroles, right? So you show up to bring compassion. These guys didn't show up because they were compassionate. They showed up because they were sick. They were afflicted. They had diseases. They wanted healing. It's like they don't even care that Jesus might be hurting. Jesus might be suffering. Jesus might need a little alone time. But these crowds, they run all around this lake to get there so that they're on the other side just waiting for him. But the lesson that his disciples begin to learn comes in verse 14. When Jesus landed and saw the large crowds, he had compassion on them. And he healed the sick. You see, their needs were more important to him than his own sorrow and his own suffering at that time. Jesus continues to teach the disciples. He wants them to see that these people are to become their ministry. And so he teaches them several lessons. First of all, that they are to have compassion. That they aren't to just think about themselves, but that they are to have compassion. And not only that, but they must learn to see the crowds through the eyes of Jesus and take personal responsibility about their needs. You see, Jesus didn't just look at them and say, "Oh, I feel sorry for you because you're sick." But he healed their sickness and their disease. And that's the lesson that Jesus wants his disciples to understand. And who are his disciples today? Us. You might want to write these things down because they might come up like Wednesday night in a discussion class. But I want us to go on and read the next part of this event, beginning in verse 15. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and they said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." And Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Well, bring them to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. And then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. The disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000, beside women and children. Now, the disciples, they did have some of this compassion stuff. They recognized that there was a need of the people. The people were going to need food. So the common response, the very human response is, if people are out here in the country and it's getting time for them to eat, send them to town. That's where McDonald's is, right? So that's what they say, let's send them to town. They understand some compassion, but what they don't understand yet is God's power. And so when Jesus tells them don't send them to town, you feed them, their response is, again, very human, very practical, and it's actually very right. They said, we can't. We've only got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And while their response really reflects an accurate assessment of their own limitations, they failed to perceive that Jesus' commands are always accompanied by sufficient resources and power and empowerment to accomplish that which He commands. See, they looked at their limited resources, and Jesus wants to show them that it's not about what you have. Not about what you can provide. The disciples have to learn that, I went ahead of myself, that He who calls them to service will also equip them for the task at hand. And so Jesus has them bring to Him what they have, and then He has the people, and literally it says He has them recline, like they would recline at the table for a banquet or something. He has the people sit down preparing for a meal. And then Jesus takes the 5 loaves and He lifts it to heaven. And I believe the Greek here says, and He blessed. Now we always think that means He blessed the bread. But it doesn't say He blessed it. He says He blessed, or He gave thanks. And I wonder what the disciples, what was going through their head with all of this. 1,000 people sitting around there. Jesus has got 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish. And He lifts it up and He says, thanks. And then He hands it out. And that's not the kind of prayer that you would expect. Because you would expect a prayer more along the lines of, Father, thank You for this food which we are about to receive, and may You expand it and bless it enough that everyone here can partake of a part of it, that it will nourish our bodies for furtherance of service in Thy kingdom. And if You do not bless it, that everyone can have a piece, then Your will be done. In My name I pray. That's what we would think Jesus would say. But instead He says thanks, as if that's enough. And then He hands it to the disciples. And the disciples go and they hand it out. And in doing that, He's teaching His disciples another lesson, is that they have a vital intermediary role between bringing heaven's blessings to bear on a human predicament. They have a responsibility to take the things that God has given and help and put those into place in people's lives where people need. You see, it's not about just recognizing a need, but it's about seeing that you have been chosen to do something about that need, and that God is going to provide you what you need to accomplish His will. They must learn that they are to be true shepherds who minister to the flock by relying not on themselves and not on their limited resources, but by relying on divine resources to supply whatever is needed to feed the people of God. That's the lessons that Jesus teaches here, and He teaches them in a very hands-on way. No, you guys feed them. We can't feed them. You're right. But you're about to learn a very important lesson. And they do. And I think, church, sometimes we stand where the disciples were before Jesus touched the bread. We know we've been given orders to go and make disciples. But we sometimes get so caught up in our limited resources. Well, we don't have this, or we don't have that. We don't have the praise band. We don't have the big glass building. We don't have the money. We don't have a good preacher. And yet, if God has given us the task, won't He provide the resources we need to accomplish His task? Amen. So that's one of the lessons that He taught them. But there's another lesson that He teaches that comes up beginning in verse 22. We're going to read through all of this, but then we're going to focus on a couple of verses. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead of Him to the other side while He dismissed the crowd. And after He had dismissed them, He went up into the hills by Himself to pray. And when the evening came, He was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. And then Peter got down out of the boat, and he walked on the water to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they landed in Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak. And all who touched him were healed. Now I want to focus on verse 28 down through verse 30. When Peter says, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." I don't think Peter was doubting who Jesus was there. I think the way the statement is written, I know it's you. And since it's you, tell me and I can walk on the water. And that's why Jesus doesn't go into some big explanation of, "It is I, Peter. Haven't I proved to you this stuff? Don't you see?" But instead, Jesus just says to him, "Come." And in faith, Peter steps out onto the water. And I want you to think back to last Sunday's lesson, and we talked about discipleship and how Jesus wants complete, undivided attention and the complete life of the disciple. And so here we have Peter with that total focus on Jesus at the time, stepping out of the boat. He's walking across the water, and all of a sudden the wind picks up. And that catches Peter's attention, which divides his attention. And so he loses that single-minded focus on who Jesus is, and he begins to get distracted by things, and he begins to sink. And I want us to think this morning about how Peter's experience is a lesson for all the disciples who were watching this in the boat, and it's a very important lesson for us this morning. You see, Peter begins this episode with a single-minded focus and faith. And sometimes we get there, don't we? There have been points in our lives. Maybe it was at vacation Bible camp, or maybe it was something you read, or maybe it was a great sermon you heard sometime, that all of a sudden you're like, "Yes, I get it now. And I trust Jesus with every single thing in my life." And that's the way Peter was when he stepped out on that boat. But then he got distracted, which is the way we do sometimes. We can be very focused about Jesus one minute and being a disciple, and then the phone rings. Or the kids walk in. Or we get out of bed, or something that just shifts everything and we get distracted. But then when we realize that we're sinking, like Peter did, we call out. We say, "Lord, save me." And I want us to notice the response of Jesus. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. Sometimes I think we think to ourselves, "Well, I'm not going to ask Jesus to help me yet because I think I can get back up on the water by myself. Or I'm going to wait until I get everything just right, because if I turn to him now, he's going to say, 'I think I'm going to let you go under 3 more times, see if you'll learn a lesson.'" But notice Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him. And then Jesus, in his infinite wisdom, provides a great opportunity for growth. He asks him a question. "Ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" We always focus on Jesus' statement of, "Oh, ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" as if it was a scorn or a punishment, but maybe Jesus was trying to teach him. "Tell me, Peter, why did you doubt?" You know, have you ever noticed how sometimes we learn more when someone asks us a question than if they just tell us what we've done wrong? Any of you experienced that before? Absolutely. And Jesus was the master. He would ask a question that would reveal what was really, truly going on. And so Jesus here provides an opportunity for growth. And he does that for us as well. Why did you doubt? And with this, the disciples in the boat, they all respond together. They don't respond like they did in their last boat trip with Jesus. And I don't know if you remember this. Back in chapter 8, they're all on a boat trip with Jesus again, and the big storm comes up. Remember, they go down, and they're all panicked, and he's sleeping. They wake him up. Said, "We're all going to drown," and he calms the storm. And you remember their response then? He said, "What kind of man is this, that even the winds and the waves obey him?" But now they don't answer that way. How do they respond this time? They worship him by saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." You see, discipleship does not begin with our perfect faith. It begins when we understand who Jesus really is. That he is the Son of God. And when we understand that, we begin allowing him to direct our lives a little more. He becomes our Lord. He becomes our master. He becomes the author of our lives. He writes the script. We live the part. He commands. We obey. He instructs. We learn and we put into practice the things that he's told us to do. Sometimes we do this really well and we're walking on water. Other times we don't do it very good at all and we're sloshing through the deep end of the pool and finally even have to call out for help. But our Lord is always there to rescue us, to lift us to safety. You see, Jesus calls us to be disciples, to follow him, to trust him, that he will provide everything we have to accomplish what he's called us to do. And he understands that sometimes our faith is great and other times we get distracted. He knows that. Peter did it. Paul did it. James, John, over and over again, the disciples do it. Jesus understands that we're goof-ups, people. That we're not perfect. All he says is, but I want you to trust me that I am. So when you're sinking, call me. I'll lift you up. I'll teach you. Lead you where you need to be. And this morning, this same Jesus stands right here. He knows where you are. He knows how deep underwater you are. And he's standing there saying, when are you going to call? Why don't you just ask me? I'll lift you up. I'll teach you. And we'll walk on the water again. So this morning, if you need to call out, if you need Jesus to lift you up, teach you how to walk beside him more closely, we're going to stand, we're going to sing a song. We call it an invitation song, and it's your opportunity to respond to Jesus' invitation. To come walk with him. Let him lift you, let him carry you, let him save you. If you need to do that this morning, please come while we stand.